of the city. I don't think you know how beautiful you are. You're beautiful. What God is doing here is beautiful. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Lou, and I get the privilege of being a part of this church. I've been a part of this church since it began over there at the old Millennium Club. And it's an incredible honor and a privilege to be led by the pastors that we get to be led by, Chris and Charity Carmody, who relentlessly pursue the glory of God in this city and in this state. It's powerful. The other thing that I wanted to honor as well is I want to honor the men of this house. I want to honor the men in my life. I want to honor the men in this house. I want to honor my father, my husband, my brother, my brothers that I have. I want to honor the brothers in arms and the fathers in this house as well. Matt said something powerful about how God uses the voices of men and women across the world. And I love that in this house, I was in a meeting this week earlier with some of my brothers here, talking about this service, and I was thinking how incredible when I walked out, how incredible as a woman to feel and just completely carried, completely empowered, like they are there on the front line, just ready to take a hill with me. That's a powerful way to feel as a woman in any circle, and that's a powerful way to feel in the church. We are so, so blessed. So I want to honor the men. So what I will be sharing today, first, before I get started, I want to say that what I will be sharing today is a piece of it has been a gift to me from the knowledge and wisdom of Alaska Native elders. And I want to first honor them and give away the credit. I also want to say that everything that I shared today is straight out of the Word of God. And it's for the glory of God. There's going to be nothing that is preached that isn't gospel. You have my promise. There will be nothing that is preached that isn't gospel. There will be nothing that is preached that isn't straight out of His Word. And there's going to be nothing that is preached today that is self-help. Hear that. There will be nothing that comes from this stage that is self-help. It will be gospel, because that is the power to transform lives. That's the power. Every sound that you hear today from my mouth in this room, every moment is going to be a cry for us to lift up our eyes to the one who can save, the one who can heal. That's the only thing you're going to hear from this stage. Before we begin, I want to read this Psalm 119 as a declaration over this service. I'm going to change the pronoun, the possessive singular, to the possessive plural here to include all of us. May our cry come before you, Lord. Give us understanding according to your word. May our supplication come before you. Deliver us according to your promise. May our lips overflow with praise, for you teach us your decrees. May our tongue sing of your word, for all your commands are righteous. May your hand be ready to help us, for we have chosen your precepts. We long for your salvation, Lord, and your law gives us delight. We thank you for the revelation of wholeness that is only found in your word, God. We turn our hearts, we turn our attention, we turn our minds to you. We say that let every other voice be silenced other than the voice of your Holy Spirit. We pray these things in your name. Amen. So I'm going to start off with an excerpt from an article from the Washington Post from 2018, from June 2018. It says, "This is what happens inside children when they are forcibly separated from their parents. Their heart rate goes up. Their body releases a flood of stress hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline. Those stress hormones can start killing off dendrites, the little branches in the brain cells that transmit messages. In time, the stress can start killing off neurons, and especially in young children, wreak dramatic and long-term damage, both psychologically and to the physical structure of the brain. If you think of the brain as a light bulb, it's as if there was a dimmer that reduced their little minds from a 100-watt light bulb to 30 watts. So imagine that's the impact of trauma. The reason child-parent separation has such devastating effects is because it attacks one of the most fundamental and critical needs in human biology. From the time they are born, children emotionally attach to their caregiver, and vice versa. Skin-to-skin contact for newborns, for example, is critical to their development, research shows. A child's sense of safety, of what safety means, depends on that first relationship. And without it, the brain develops differently. The reason such children often develop PTSD later in life is that those neurons start firing irregularly. Research on indigenous children who were removed from their families and placed in church and government boarding schools, as many Alaska Native and American Indian children were, also showed long-lasting effects. Indigenous children were nearly twice as likely to be arrested or criminally charged as adults, 60% more likely to struggle with addiction, and more than twice as likely to attempt suicide. Other studies have shown separation leading to increased aggression, withdrawal, anxiety, depression, and cognitive difficulties. If you take the moral, spiritual, and even political aspect out of it, from a strictly medical and scientific point of view, what we as a country are doing and have done to children will take lifetimes to undo. So I know that was heavy. That was a hard way to start. And you're probably, some of you are like, hey, what did I walk into? What am I getting into? Is she just trying to poke? Is she trying to stir? Because we are a high challenge church, so I'm going to deliver a high challenge message. Remember what Chris and Charity said a couple weeks ago when they started this incredible series talking about Born Hungry. They talked about the poverty mindset. They talked about the middle class mindset and the wealthy mindset. And they spoke about how poverty and middle class mindsets of the world are only concerned with what impacts them directly, what affects them directly, what affects their bottom line directly. But a wealthy mindset of the world says that what is happening in Syria, what is happening in Guatemala, what is happening in Venezuela, what is happening in Alaska, and what is happening to the human beings created in the image of God in those places, those things matter to me because they matter to Christ. That's a wealthy mindset of the world. So besides that challenge, I use this article because it illustrates what I'll be preaching on today, and that is the roots of hunger. So we've been walking through this message. We've been talking about how hunger shows up, how it impacts us, how it plays out in different places in our lives. Remember last week Chris said, if you're happy, everyone help me out here. If you're happy and you know it. If you're hungry and you know it. Eat, yeah. Get a sandwich. Eat something. Fill your belly. But what happens if you are hungry and you are not fed? What happens when children are born? And children are born by God's design helpless, flailing, crying, needing. What happens when that need is not met? Hunger grows. Need grows. That's what happens. So I'm preaching today about those roots of hunger that we were all born with, that Chris and Charity have been talking about. We've all been born with, but how do those roots grow? And looking around this room, I have a feeling that you all are like me. There's probably a forest of hunger in here from needs that were not met in the way that God intended, and they grew up into trees. So I know I'm not alone in this. Hunger is the result of unmet need. Pure and simple. I'll say that again. Hunger is the result of unmet need. Hunger grows when it is not fed. So I'm going to ask you, and you can shout back to me, who in God's design should be the first to feed us? Who in God's design should be the first to hold us? That's right. Who in God's design should be the first home for us? Who in God's design should be the first to love us unconditionally? Extra points for you for your boldness. I love it. You're right. Our parents, again and again and again, the answer is mom and dad. That's who God first designed us, placed us in to have those initial needs met. So the foundation of our relationship with hunger, with lack, and with need is built on this primary relationship. We were designed with needs and with hunger, and that hunger grows in direct correlation to that core and most primal relationship. So why do you think that the characteristics of God are explained in terms of family? He's called Father, he's called Son, he's called a mother that draws her little ones in for protection. God describes himself in family terms, and he puts us in family. He could have put us in any structure in the world. He could have had humanity go out in any form, but instead he chose and he designed family. And that's what he placed us in. And that's because family should be, by design, our first glimpse of him. But when it doesn't operate as it was designed, when those needs are not met as they should be by our first providers, hunger grows, need grows, lack grows, longing grows. So I read pieces of an article that they talk about the impact of child separation from parents, of what happens when the basic need of connection is not met, how it actually changes the brain chemistry and does huge damage. The truth is, we were created with specific needs that were designed to be met by loving parents. There's no way to get around this. And it is God's way of imprinting his design for relationship, his design for sonship on our hearts from the womb. Let's talk about some of those primary needs. Our first need is safety and connection. The article referenced skin to skin, that moment when the baby is placed on the chest of the mother and the father, but it goes beyond that. A baby's brain actually needs love, safety, and security to develop properly. And a mother and father's arms should be the first place that a child experiences relentless acceptance and safety. A child also needs nourishment and shelter. These are basic needs that when they are not met, not only impact the physical well-being and development of a child, but also their mental, emotional well-being as well. A baby soon learns that when they cry, they'll get a response, right? Any of you out there that are parents, have been parents, you know children learn, I cry when I have a need, and that need is met. But what happens when they cry when they have a need and that nobody comes? That also teaches them something. A child growing up without having their needs predictably met learns to live in a heightened state of survival. Some people call this living out of the lizard brain. So if there are any neurosurgeons in here, please have grace for me. Please be gentle with me. I'm going to give you a really quick synopsis. So you have the neocortex. That's kind of like responsible for logical thought. And then you have the limbic system. That's kind of the seat of empathy. So a lot of the feelings, the value systems, those things. And then you have the lizard brain, the brainstem. That's given to us in order to survive. Everybody tap right back here. That's your lizard brain. Right back here. That's the seat of hunger. The lizard brain is actually the strongest of the three parts of the brain. When that takes over, you go on autopilot. It's a game over, honey, at that point. One researcher called the lizard brain said it was in charge of fight, flight, freezing, feeding, fear, and fornication. And that is not a healthy place to live. That is not a healthy place for a child to learn to live. But that's what happens. That's what happens when trauma is present. That's what happens when lack is present. They learn to live in survival. And they become adults who live in survival, who live from the lizard brain. The next core need we were created with to be met by healthy parents is a sense of identity. Parents are supposed to raise us with a deep knowledge of who we are and whose we are. That's their job, given to them by God. Researchers actually say that a baby, till they're nearly 2, so closely identifies themselves with their mother that they actually think that they are the same person. Imagine if the mother is not present, or she's distant or unpredictable. Imagine how a piece of their identity, growing their identity, is impacted when that happens. The last core need we were born with to be met by healthy parents is skills for life. It's God's design for parents to give their children skills for living healthily. From being in healthy relationships, to tying their shoes, to riding a bike, to baking cookies, to changing a tire, it is God's design for children to learn that from their parents. It doesn't mean that if you didn't teach your child to bake cookies that you're a bad mom or dad. That's not what I'm saying. But there are things, and those of you, think back, and if you can, because I know some of us can't, think back to a positive moment where your mother or your father took the time to teach you something, a skill. You know, in that moment, that was far more about learning a skill. That was a moment of connection. That was a moment of realizing, of pride. This is who we are, and this is how we do what we do. That's an incredibly important need for a child to receive from their parents. So what happens when we grow up in imperfect homes? What happens when those core needs are not met by a present and loving mother and father? What then happens to the brain and soul of a child? Hunger is what happens. Hunger grows. When trauma is present, when needs are not met, need grows. And they become a driving force in our lives. I know that this is heavy. I know that this is, you're probably wondering, okay, where's she going with this? But hang in there with me. I'm setting the stage because I want to take you to what God does, how God works in this. Ask yourselves this. Did you know your dad's approval? Can you hear his voice in your head saying, I'm proud of you, son. I'm proud of you, daughter. Did you grow up hearing stories from your mom about how wanted you were even before you were born? Or are you driven by hunger to receive approval and affirmation at any cost? Do you push yourself professionally, never feeling like you're enough? Doubting yourself? Do you pursue affirmation from relationships and ways of living that actually harm you? Were your mom and dad a safe place for you? Do you remember feeling that sense of security of being held by them? Or does your hunger for safety drive you into hiding, seeking isolation, building walls, in an attempt to never be hurt again? Did your parents provide for you with basic needs like healthy food? Or does lack in that area drive you to have an unhealthy relationship with food? Was there a safe, secure shelter to always come home to? Or are you driven by hunger to always stay ahead, to accumulate finances or possessions, anything to make you feel secure in the world? Or maybe your parents were safe. Maybe they provided for you well. But they were so engrossed in their lives, doing many times good things, maybe even so involved in the church that you were missed in the process. And there is hunger in that for you too. Maybe you had a largely healthy relationship with your parents, but you don't get off the hook. We were all born with hunger. Maybe your hunger grew when you experienced rejection, when you felt like you didn't fit. Maybe your hunger grew like mine did from a messed up version of religion and reality you grew up in. But whatever way it grew, it is with us. We are born hungry. And when that hunger is not fed in the way that God designed, we grow hungrier and hungrier and hungrier with each passing day. So now that I have you, maybe not convinced, but at least intrigued by this idea that your relationship with hunger starts in that first family. Let's look at Exodus. The context here is Moses and Aaron have gone before Pharaoh. They have told him again and again, let my people go. Pharaoh has repeatedly refused. Plagues have come, plagues have gone. Finally, after the last plague, which strikes the firstborn sons of Egypt, Pharaoh relents and Israel leaves Egypt, only to be pursued again by the Egyptian army. So God parts the Red Sea, and again he saves them. They go into the wilderness, they become thirsty, and God heals the waters of Marah for them. So here they are, that's the context. We are now brought up to Exodus 16, verse 1 through 4. They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month, after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven for you." I love that. That I'm about to. That's like an exasperated mama, and she's like, "You know what? I've had enough. I'm about to just rain some bread from heaven on you. You've pushed me. You've pushed me. Watch me now." That's what God is saying. So here we have the Israelites 2.5 months out of captivity, and they are hungry. If there was ever a people with mommy and daddy issues, it's the children of Israel in the book of Exodus, right? They have lived more than 400 years, the Bible says more than 400 years in a strange land, and much of that time as slaves. Generations were born far from home, growing up to build cities for a Pharaoh who worked them to death and killed their children when they got too numerous. Talk about trauma. They have gotten to a point that they even regard this Pharaoh as their father. They look to him for provision, for permission, for safety. He controlled life and death. He controlled freedom. He controlled the food supply. He was their father. After 400 years as slaves, the Israelites didn't know who they were nor whose they were. Think about this. The 10 plagues, they weren't just about the Egyptians. They weren't just for the Egyptians. They weren't just to show Pharaoh who was God. But God sent those plagues to show the Israelites who their God was. This was God showing up and saying, "Watch your dad fight for you. Watch me defend you. You who have not been defended, kept safe, not been championed, watch my strong arm and outstretched hand to deliver and to save." This was Daddy running to the rescue and beating up the biggest of the schoolyard bullies and sending his crew scattering. That was our God against Pharaoh and the gods of the Egyptians. But the people that God led out of Egypt were traumatized, were slaves in their minds. 400 years in captivity, living in survival, does something to your brain. It does something to the way you raise the next generation. You end up living and raising your children to live out of a lizard brain. Why do you think God had sent Moses down the river to be raised by a daughter of Pharaoh? Maybe it's because he needed to prepare someone who wouldn't be raised with the mentality and identity of a slave, but who would be raised with the mentality and identity of a son of a kingdom with all the authority and provision that comes with it. He was preparing his leader. He knew, he's like, "You know what? I can't have a man operating out of his lizard brain. I need to prepare a man who's going to lead." So here we have the Israelites. Obviously, in their lizard brain, because they say of the place that they were just freed from, they say of the place that they were nothing more than slaves, the place where their children were killed. They said of that place, "It would be better for us if we were back in Egypt because at least there was steak." That's what they're saying. This is a place that has cost them everything, their lives, the lives of their families. And they're saying, you know what? It's better back there. My tummy was full. It's like hearing, and I say this with so much gentleness, but for those that have been stuck in domestic violence, and again, with gentleness, hear this. Saying, yes, they beat me, but at least when they're not drinking, they're nice to me. That's the perspective. That's the perspective of the children of Israel. That's what happens when our brains are hooked on trauma, on hunger, on lack. That's what happens to the brains of slaves and survivors. Your brain actually rewires. The brains of the Israelites were rewired by trauma, by living out of survival. They were sick. Mentally and emotionally, they were sick. They might even had PTSD. They didn't know who they were. With a father like Pharaoh, it's safe to assume that all those core needs that they were designed to have met, they weren't. And so instead, they were driven by that lizard brain hunger. Do you identify with the Israelites? Has a life driven by hunger, by lack, by need and longing left you living out of survival? Are you living like a slave instead of a son or daughter? Are you living like Pharaoh is your father? Are you longing for the steaks of Egypt when God is standing and saying, I have freedom for you? I have whole, perfect, provision-filled freedom for you. Who's your daddy? Who's your daddy? The way you live your life is like a direct correlation who you know your daddy is. And are we stuck living like Pharaoh is our father? In Deuteronomy 8, verse 2 through 5 says, and you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out on you. Your foot did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. So what did God do about his people living in survival? What did he do about their sick minds and hearts? He leads them into the wilderness for 40 years. That's what he does. He says, my people are sick. They don't know who they are. They need a brain rewire. They need a new mind. They need 40 years of walking in the wilderness with me. Remember, this is a God not in a hurry. He had waited 400 years of their slavery before he pulled them out. So 40 is a blink of an eye to him. When I was studying this, I thought, I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at the names of God, and I bet you I'm going to find that the names of God that Israel called him in the wilderness changed as their revelation of him changed. And I really thought what I would find that Israel shifted from calling him Creator, Jehovah, to Father. But that's not what I found. And what I found brought me to tears. Because what I discovered, that it was in the wilderness, that it was the first place that God was revealed to the children of Israel is Yahweh Rapha. God, our healer. Yahweh Rapha, the God who heals me, the God who heals us. That is what they began to call him in the wilderness. The wilderness is about healing. The wilderness that you are in is for your healing. Feel that. You are not being punished. You are not being humiliated. You are not being forgotten. You are being healed. Yahweh Rapha, the God who heals you, is bringing you into the wilderness to change you, to get you from that lizard mind, that lizard brain, into the mind of Christ. That's what he's doing in the wilderness. You see, just like the Israelites, he brings us into the wilderness not to literally rub our noses in the sand of our stubbornness and stupidity. He brings us there because he says, I have wholeness for you here. Like he says in Hosea, therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly toward her. That was the purpose of our God, to spend 40 years healing his people. When you see it that way, you view those 40 years so differently. How beautiful, how painstaking of our Father to rush through, not to push us through, but to take the time to heal us. And not just to heal us, but to heal generations. There were generations that were born in the wilderness that were not born slaves. He needed to heal generations. He needed to stop that cycle, intergenerational trauma. He needed to stop that. And he took them into the wilderness to do that. When people have experienced significant trauma at the hands of their parents as children, there's a type of therapy that some trauma therapists use, and it's called reparenting. Reparenting. God needed to reparent Israel. A people who lived like Pharaoh was their father, he needed to reparent them. Remember the core needs we talked about? He needed to meet those core needs. Safety and security. The God who would fight off and defend the defenseless, the victor that would storm the doors of the jail, of the workhouses, and let slaves go free, the dad who would fight off bullies. He was meeting their need for safety and security in the wilderness. Nourishment and shelter. He fed them with manna from heaven. Their clothing did not wear out. Their shoes did not wear out. He was meeting their need for nourishment and shelter in the wilderness. Identity. No longer slaves, but sons. No longer a part of a lineage of dead men, but now a part of a lineage of priests, of kings, of heirs. It was in the wilderness that he instructed them to build his tabernacle. It was the wilderness where he instructed them to say, I will make my dwelling place with you. It was in the wilderness that he rose up a generation of priests. It was in the wilderness that he called out the Levites and said, you are separated to God. It was in the wilderness where he healed them, where he set up a practice of worship with them. It's in the wilderness that he made the map for the cross. He did that in the wilderness. He reparented Israel. He says, know then in your heart, as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. And why does he discipline? To teach us how to live well. He gave them skills for living. He gave them skills for living in the promised land. If he had taken them straight through to the promised land, they would have lived like slaves. He needed 40 years to give them skills to live like sons and daughters. He met their core needs in the wilderness. He refathered them there. For 40 years, he wasn't in a hurry. Like the great physician that he is, he took his time gently, rewiring their minds, healing their hearts, changing their names, restoring their souls, bringing them, calling them gently, step by step, home. Many times we want a supernatural touch. We want a miracle of healing. And if trauma was part of your story, if lack in the relationship with your mom and dad was part of your story, a lot of the time in the church, what you might hear is saying, you have a new mind. You're not in your lizard brain anymore. And that is true. You might hear, you have the mind of Christ, so quick, bam, instant healing. Start walking in your new identity. We might even require that as leaders of the people that we lead, saying, come on, get over your trauma. Get over the past in Jesus' name. And while it is true that we have been born into a new identity, into a new family, into a new mind, just like God does, he doesn't always do it overnight. He works in the way that he wants to work to bring healing to his people. And as leaders, we have to walk right alongside and pace with him, with the people that we lead. Can he miraculously heal? Yes, he is God. He is all-powerful. He can reach in and change hearts. He can do Saul to Paul, if that's what he wants to do. But you know, with Paul, he was walking it out. He was working out his salvation in fear and trembling. There was still some lizard brain things going on that he had to get a new mind around, and that took years. Could he have led the children of Israel across the Sinai in 6 days? He could have. I looked it up. That's actually if you go from point A to point B. 6 days. But he would be walking into the promised land with a bunch of slaves. We want a miracle. We want to say, bam, I've arrived in my promised land. Bam, I'm healed. But oftentimes our God, with so much grace and so much wisdom and so much mercy, takes the slow route. He doesn't want slaves. He wants sons and daughters. He took that time of rewiring. He took that time for healing. And just like Israel, he leads us through a wilderness of healing. Little by little, so lovingly, reparenting us, renewing our mind, revealing himself as Yahweh Rapha, the God who heals me. He is more interested in developing sons and daughters than in doing signs and wonders. He is interested in growing a generation of sons and daughters, and he doesn't need a big splash to do that. He's saying, no, it's going to look ugly. It's going to look like thirst. It's going to look like hunger. It's going to look like 40 years in a wilderness, but I'm bringing out sons. I'm bringing out daughters. Verse 3 says, and he humbled you, and he let you hunger, and he fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you to know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. That word humbled there, in one of the root meanings in the original Hebrew, that word humbled does not mean to humiliate. Does not mean that. That word humbled means to fast. He's literally saying, I fasted you and caused you to hunger. I fasted you and caused you to hunger. In Judaic tradition, the purpose and context of a fast is for disruption and for restoration. Disruption of the complacency and norm of life in order to bring attention to recenter, to restore, and renew a connection to God as the only sustaining life force. That is the purpose of a fast. So the purpose of this hunger was to recenter and reconnect us with our source. That's the purpose of your hunger, is to recenter and reconnect you to your God. It goes on to say that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone. He says, I'm disrupting your life, your rhythms with hunger, so that you will know that you cannot live by those things that you try to fill yourself with. You cannot live off mere bread. You cannot live off mere approval, mere possessions, mere sexual satisfaction, mere provision. But you must return to me, the only thing that can fill you and feed you. I birthed you hungry. I birthed you hungry. I birthed you with a longing, with an imprint, with a homing beacon for my spirit that is always, always, always turning home again. Yes. Isn't it powerful that thing, isn't it powerful that thing that so often gets us into trouble by the things that we fill it with, the things that we try to stuff, that hunger, it was given us as a call home. Yeah. That's why we were born with it. That's the only reason why. What's interesting is that the only time in the Mosaic Law that a fast is commanded is the Day of Atonement. They practiced fasts at other times, but those were more from tradition of the time. The only place in Mosaic law it is commanded is connected to the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement was the one day a year the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, carrying the blood of a spotless sacrifice, and sprinkle it before the ark on the mercy seat. This one time of year was when he went in to make propitiation for the sins of Israel, and Israel was commanded to fast. In that fast, that disruption, that repurposing and recentering of hunger was connected to atonement. Yes. How powerful. So what do we do with our hunger? We fast. We disrupt. We turn. We return. And because of our high priest, we can go boldly, driven by our hunger before the very face of God. Into the holiest of all, and where all our core needs are met. All our hunger is satisfied. Where our lizard brains are replaced with a new mind. Where our old natures are replaced with a new identity. A new nature. We can run to this tabernacle in the middle of the wilderness. Into the holiest of all, driven by hunger, and there we can be healed. Let your hunger drive you into the wilderness. Let your hunger drive you into your healing. Let your hunger drive you to seek your heavenly Father, to seek your new identity as no longer a slave, but a son and a daughter. Let your hunger drive you to a fast of returning to the all-sustaining one. Let your hunger drive you to the mercy seat. Let your hunger become the day of your atonement, the day where you're called by a new name, a new nature. The Lord your God, who goes before you, will himself fight for you, just as he did for you in Egypt before your eyes, and in the wilderness where you have seen how the Lord your God carried you as a man carries his son. Father, you are Yahweh Rapha, the God who heals us. Drive us into the wilderness of healing. Drive us into your tabernacle before your mercy seat to cry out for the only thing that can heal us, the only thing that can make us whole. Jesus. close with a benediction. It's not a sermon, it's not a prayer, it's simply a blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance and cause you to run to the mercy seat, to fast, to disrupt, to recenter on your only life source. Go in peace. Serve the Lord with joy. Thanks be to God.